Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now, I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. My guest today is Leslie Weinstein of the OCD Tech. I want to mention to the audience, we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus is on, as a managed service provider, our focus is on organizations that are seeking certification. So that's mostly who's here joining us today. If you do have some questions during the session, please feel free to send those in using the Q&A link within Zoom, and I will try to work as many of those questions in as I can. I'll start with a quick introduction of our guest. Leslie Weinstein is CMMC Practice Lead with audit and advisory firm OCD Tech. She comes to OCD with a background as an Army military intelligence officer, a DoD policy analyst, and a national security fellow with the Foundation for Defense Democracies. Leslie has been really focused a lot on CMMC since it came out. She's providing consulting services to companies that are getting started on their compliance journey. So today, really looking forward to hearing Leslie's kind of boots on the ground view of the foundational steps towards CMMC compliance, hoping to keep it very practical for companies that are tackling these same challenges that Leslie is working with on a day-to-day basis. Leslie, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Our audience, as I mentioned, is mostly organizations that are looking to get certified under CMMC. All of them are tracking CMMC very closely and making progress down the path. Really looking forward to your perspectives on, I guess, the early steps, how to get started. So the CMMC program has been described as sort of a crawl, walk, run, and that was more in terms of how the 5-year rollout is going to happen. But I think that same model applies, to some extent to the companies looking to get started. I mean, this is not something you have to have done yesterday. It's a process people are working through. So as you're working with these organizations that are trying to move in a CMMC direction, what's the typical starting point that you're seeing? What prior work is CMMC standing on or building upon, or is this more of a fresh start on the cyber hygiene topic?
So unfortunately, I think this is a fresh start on cyber hygiene. A lot of people have been performing these ad hoc functions, and a lot of the companies that we're seeing don't have policies. If they do have policies, it's because they have a facility clearance and they had to have an insider threat program. And so they're thinking that they can just use some of these policies or reuse them. And yes, you should and can reuse policies. There's no new requirement to have, clearly defined set of policies very prescribed. You do have to have policies, but you should reuse some of what you're doing. The very first step, though, and this is the first step in a consulting engagement, it's the first step of a CMMC assessment, it's the first step in preparing for all of this, which is scoping. And unfortunately, the scoping is where we have the least amount of information. In fact, on the CMMC AB Town Hall last night, the DoD provided an update and said that they are still finalizing their scoping guidance. So DoD has yet to provide definitive, clear guidance on scoping, and it is the very first thing that you should be doing. So it's unfortunate that we're here, but by scoping, I mean conducting a logical exercise of information flow. Last night on the town hall, if anyone tuned in, they talked a lot about CUI and where your CUI goes, but it's broader than that. It's really your FCI, your federal contract information, and specifically your DoD federal contract information. So the first thing you should be doing as a company is thinking about how you intake that information, whether you get it from an email or you get it from a portal that you go bring information from. How does that information come into your network and where does it flow? Because wherever that information goes is now in scope for your CMMC. So a lot of our engagements kicked off late last year, and we kind of overlooked the scoping step because we just took it for granted. Maybe during the contract process, we asked how many endpoints they had, and we were like, okay, yeah, we're pretty certain we can do this engagement. But when we got down to the domain by domain walkthrough and asking, how you limit access to your devices on your system, the scoping kind of blew up because they were like, oh, well, we put information here and we store information there. And some people use a cloud and some people use removable storage. So we would kind of have to stop and take a step back and reassess the scope. So scope is the number one thing you should do if you have to have a consultant. They're probably very expensive by hour. So if you can do your scoping up front, it would cut down on the amount of hours that you have to engage your consultant to hammer that out, because that's the first thing you should do.
I agree. That's often not very clear to folks when they start is, what does CMMC need to apply to? I have an audience question I want to work in because it goes to the point of CUI. And you mentioned CUI as I mean, that's the crux of what needs to be in scope for level 3, certainly FCI, broader scale. So maybe this question is about CUI, maybe it could apply to both. So my question is, how does a company decide what data is and is not CUI when the contracting entity does not specify what data is CUI to the primary or secondary contractor? So in this example, the audience member says, DD 254 forms, man, this is complicated. Let's just say that the applicable items are blank. And so the question is, do we treat all data for that customer as CUI? Or should we use something like DLP to go through and tag things like contract numbers, serial numbers, technical and contract data? So I guess, what are you finding as people are wrestling with this? Is it about, expanding the net to be as big as you need to be to capture everything that might be, or trying to get to some precision over what is and what isn't?
Yeah, so that's ultimately a business decision. So if you have the resources available and you have the wherewithal to really bring your whole system into scope, and you want to just protect everything as if it's CUI, that's one course of action. A second course of action would be trying to limit that scope, right? Like trying to figure out what is CUI and what isn't CUI. So when you're trying to figure out what is and isn't CUI, ask the contracting officer, just point blank, even if those forms are blank, call them up and say, hey, what information am I creating that is possibly CUI? What are you sending me that is possibly CUI? They probably don't know, because they probably haven't sat down and figured that out, which is why that information is blank, unfortunately. So that's the first place you should go. Just ask DoD, hey, tell me. And if they can't tell you, or they say treat it all like CUI, that's also not the right answer. I think there's this misperception that everything that a federal employee tells you is true. I was a federal employee. I was an Army civilian for 5 years, and I've been on active duty for about 5 or 6 years throughout my career. And I can tell you what I told people probably isn't true. Like, I applied FOUO to everything as an intelligence officer in the IC. If it was on the unclassed side, I probably put FOUO on it. Does that mean I was right for doing it? No, I was trying to protect the information. But does everything that I marked as FOUO 5 years ago now equate to CUI? Probably not. We had the reason why we have the CUI program is because every federal agency had different methods for marking their controlled information. So there's not this one-for-one mapping of everything FOUO is now CUI. So across the DoD, the CUI thing is a new thing. It's a culture shift, which is why they're probably not telling you, because they probably don't understand it themselves. Okay, so now you still have this problem. What is FOUO, or what is CUI and what is not CUI? So there is the CUI registry that you can go look at all of the different categories of CUI. But it's important to keep in mind that to make something CUI, it has to be generated for or on behalf of the government. They have to be asking you for that information. So on the CUI registry, you'll see things like PII and health information. Those things are considered CUI only if the government is asking you to collect that information. So your company, PII, your HR records, those are not CUI because the DoD is not asking you to collect and generate that information. So if the information you're generating, if you think it might be CUI and it's for a contract, then you're on the right path because it has to have that government nexus. Then you go to the CUI registry, you look at the broad categories. Within the categories, there are types of information. So you can click on those links and it'll tell you a little bit more information about that category. It'll provide the laws that make that information sensitive. You can go look at those laws. Those are really hard to read because it's just a portion of a broader law. So you can kind of run all of that to the ground and do your best guess, like your college, like the college effort, right? The executive order that established CUI 10 years ago, it very clearly says that if something can be very strongly considered not CUI, like there's a debate over the topic and you have a lot of reasons why this should not be CUI, then it shall not be so designated. So whereas in the intelligence community, everything's classified, everything's TS, SCI, HI, HCS and Gamma. But on the unclassed side, CUI is actually intended for mass distribution, broadly distributed. If people have the legal access to it, there should be no reason why they can't access it. So they err on the side of not CUI versus CUI.
I appreciate the explanation on government nexus, and that is something that has come up with a lot of conversations where, you know, the data categories listed on the NARA website are very broad, but so you may have that data for all kinds of reasons that are not related to the government at all, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And then that doesn't make them CUI just because they fit into that category. So along the lines I want to dive a little deeper into the scoping thing, but first I want to maybe take what you were just doing, which was sort of educating folks on some of these sort of fundamentals, right? These are the stuff you just talked about, very interesting, had really nothing to do with CMMC, right? I mean, this is a preliminary step of deciding what your data is that you're dealing with. So, you know, we know CMMC is an emerging standard. There's a lot of questions. You mentioned the scoping is not very well defined. CUI, obviously out there as an open-ended topic. So, you know, that's really, we put this town hall session together back in May to help sort those things out. And I think we've done a good job of having folks on that can kind of cut through and get to some of these new things. But as you're helping to take organizations down the path to compliance, how much of your early work is education, helping build an understanding of the standard, how to interpret it, how it applies? I mean, how much is that before you even can have the scoping conversation?
Every single call with a client, whether a prospective client, current client, down the path, halfway through an engagement or kicking off an engagement, at least the first 10 minutes of the call is an education session. Whether it's, let me fill you in on what's happened in the last couple of weeks. Let me educate you on CUI. Let me educate you about this domain that we're about to walk through. Every single call kicks off with an education session. I'm getting my MBA from Cornell, and in our innovations class a couple semesters ago, they said, never enter an industry that you have to educate your clients about what you provide. And so I'm like, dang, I entered the wrong industry because I have you have like every single call starts off with an education session. Like, let me help you define what this is. Let me help you understand this requirement. Let me help you understand how this control maps to this control and why they're related, but not really, and why this one seems the same, but there's like, so every step of the way is an education session.
If you've got it into 10 minutes, you're doing pretty well at it.
Those are for like the, you know, clients we've had for months, but like the new clients, literally we'll have a kickoff call. And I think that we can start the work. And on the next call, it's really just an hour-long briefing on what we're going to do and educate. Yeah. So, yeah.
So let me, yeah, I think you're right. I think it's certainly an upfront piece, but I think it's part of the ongoing piece. Again, it's an emerging standard. We're all learning things. And I think that's part of, you know, part of the reason we have these every week. Part of the reason there's always something new to talk about is, you know, we don't have years and years of case law about how to do it, where we can say, this is the right way, that's the wrong way. There's a lot of judgment calls.
I just told a client that today. I was like, this is Leslie's interpretation based on conversations with counterparts in the space, but like, there's no proof that our interpretation is right. So I'm telling you this as an opinion, but this is not a validated, you know, case law or even a DIBCAC assessment validated assumption. So absolutely.
And I think even when the person talking is, you know, a director on the CMMC AB, that statement, that disclaimer is necessary, right? They can't know. It's still evolving. So as we go, let me jump back to the scoping effort. As you go through that scoping effort, some companies are going to end up with all their IT scope, all their IT in scope for CMMC. Others are going to have multiple environments. Maybe they carve out systems that support non-DoD work, or they carve out systems that are used for internal functions that don't involve any FCI at all. Sometimes they're going to decide to segment systems into, say, a CUI enclave that's level 3, and then other systems that are handling FCI at level 1. Those decisions affect, you know, cost, risk, complexity. What's your advice on how to choose between those options? Like, what are the key factors that weigh into which of those paths is best? They're all allowed, right? There's no wrong answer, but right. How do people choose between those?
So I think a lot of people choose initially based on cost, right? They're like, I'm going to enclave my CUI environment and I'm going to restrict everything else, you know, to a different network or to a different whatever. We've seen just in the last month, a couple clients coming to us to enclave because it's too cumbersome in their environment. They're like, forget it, we're going to undo this enclave. We're just going to make everything a CUI environment. So I would consider cost, but also practicality. Like, is this going to severely hamper your workflow? So what works best for your company, and how can you limit scope without making it so hard? Because you don't want your employees to abide by this new process, and it's just not practical. So they're going to go behind your back and do whatever they were doing anyway. So those are two things to consider: cost plus practicality and company buy-in, right? Like, it's not just your leadership buy-in. It has, you have to get buy-in from your employees, or, enforce it somehow, or make it, you don't want them to be so frustrated with the new requirements that they either quit, or they don't do it, or they go behind your back. So it's
Not surprised to hear people almost backtracking on what sounded like a good idea initially. And I think, we've seen that too. If you have, 90% commercial and 10% DoD, segmentation almost always makes sense. If your work is mostly DoD and you're trying to split the DoD that's CUI from the DoD that's not, that's a much harder piece. And so I guess I want to ask a little bit about how that segmentation might work. You mentioned a while back in the session that, there's no definitive guidance on scoping or segmentation. So for contractors that decide to segment their network, given we don't have that definitive guidance on how strongly we need to isolate these systems, say CUI from non-CUI, what's your advice on defining the boundary in a way that is secure, but also going to pass the audit? It's a judgment call, it seems like.
It is. And for anybody to tell you that they know one way or the other is not true, right? Like, if a consultant tells you that they have the answer, run the other way, because we just heard last night in real time from DoD, from Buddy D's, who is a former client of mine because I worked for ANS. Buddy D's said that they have not settled on the scoping guidance. So we don't know how strong those segmentation demarcations have to be. So does it have to be air gapped, or can it have like some layer of firewall segmentation, or what? We don't know. So at this point, it's all a business decision, like based on, talking to someone like you, Ed, as a cybersecurity professional, talking to a compliance person, like someone at OCD Tech, coming together with the company to make that business decision based on best guesses for what we think DoD is going to say, but we just don't know, which is why this is so frustrating for the DFARS rule to be active, for the 7021 clause to be there. The pilot programs are up and running. Assessors are approved. We're waiting on C3 PAOs, but we're waiting on the foundational requirement of scoping. Like, this is the thing we should have started with. And we're, just guessing what the assessors will be able to approve is like, yes, this is a good boundary. You've sufficiently quarantined your CUI from the rest of your environment, but we don't have that yet. Yeah.
And I think, in payment card industry, PCI, for example, they have some pretty definitive guidance on how to set boundaries where credit card data is stored versus where it's not stored. In classified world, obviously some very strict boundaries there about how the systems could interconnect that would have classified and unclassified data. Very, very strict rules. But in unclassified world, not so much. So I think that's going to go to that you mentioned about people maybe saying let's de-enclave. There's a risk reduction as well as a complexity reduction, right? If you say my entire IT footprint is CMMC level 3 and you manage it as such, you do incur some cost, but it's simple and it's pretty hard to mess it up, right? In other words, you don't have to defend the boundary because you're not trying to put some segmentation. You just say all of it. So that could be maybe the path of least resistance, although sometimes higher cost. I don't know. Segmentation has cost too, so I've seen it both ways. So, see, you mentioned the auditors. What's the role of the auditors in the scope and segmentation process? So for you as a consultant, you're looking at this early on before an auditor is involved, right? Giving advice, client's going to make a decision of how to build. But now, after they've built, they bring in a CMMC assessor do their certification audit. What's the role of that auditor in those scope and segmentation decisions? Is it something they should be evaluating, weighing in on? How does that work from your
Yeah,
perspective?
so based on the little bit of guidance we have from the CMMC assessment guide, which I literally keep a printed copy here. This is not just a just for this webinar. I literally keep this here, but based on the limited guidance that we have in the very beginning of this document, it says that the company can scope their assessment. They scope it themselves. And it appears, the way that I translated it is that the assessor just has to accept it on the face value. Now, if they're undergoing an assessment and CUI, they somehow, a company talks about CUI being located outside of this scope that they've presented to the assessor, that would be a problem unless they're deciding to get that other environment certified as well. But it seems like companies establish their own scope and tell the assessor, assess these boundaries. These are my boundaries, and this is what I want assessed. And the assessor is not there to debate that or judge that or to say that you should have done this. Why, that's not the role of the assessor, according to this guidance right here.
Because that's something that if you look at, I mentioned PCI in the credit card industry, FedRAMP for cloud, specifically the auditors are charged with assessing the boundary, evaluating the strength of the boundary. Is their credit card data where it's not supposed to be? Does the cloud service offering sufficiently isolate between between the clients in the FedRAMP case? So I'm surprised a little bit that this is not something that's in the CMMC standard. Maybe it's coming.
Testing the strength of those boundaries is different than scoping your boundaries, right? Like,
fair enough.
So, yeah, so you can establish, so in the assessment guide, it says that you can have your enclave assessed, you can have your whole network assessed, you can have your whole enterprise assessed. You just have to scope it adequately and inform your assessor how it's scoped, and then they come and test that, right? So if you are having your enclave assessed and it's enclaved from the rest of your environment, but the segmentation or that, how you have it segmented and walled off, if that strength isn't sufficient, that's where you would run into issues potentially. But you can have them come and do an assessment on whatever portion or of your network. Like, that's up to you as a company seeking certification. You just have to make sure that when DoD tells us how sufficiently strong those boundaries have to be, that those are in fact implemented.
Makes sense. So for NeoSystems as a service provider, one of the things that we spend a lot of our time on is the security program foundation. So getting operational maturity in place, right? This is a new piece that hasn't been needed by a lot of companies for operational reasons, hasn't been required by regulation, but now it is. Aligning practices to the standard, getting it all documented. So we talked about education and scoping as kind of the first steps. What do you see as the right sequence beyond those steps as you dive into those maturity areas?
So it depends, right? Like, some clients come to us and they haven't purchased some of their equipment. Like, they want to build a new environment for their CUI. And so they're about to purchase laptops. And it's really, so an assessment is a point in time assessment. The CMMC assessment is a point in time. It's not future state, it's not past state, it's how you are today. So if you're planning to change your system from how it is today, like if you've done this scoping and you're like, oh gosh, I should enclave, go procure those systems first. Get them in place first. Try to configure them and implement them, as best you can to the requirements, realizing that you may not have that compliance background and understanding, but that's when you can bring a consultant to help you configure those endpoints. But have your network and your devices and your systems in place. You cannot assess a future state, thing that doesn't exist. So do all of those procurement activities, buy everything you think you need and you think you want, then start working with your consultant to configure it appropriately. The access control domain, right? A lot of the controls are setting policy and configuring those policies. So if you already have a lot of systems that are configured and you have an outsourced IT provider or an outsourced MSSP provider, they've configured your machines most likely in a way that you haven't captured or documented. So you'll have to work closely with them to start understanding how they've configured your machines. And it's not that you need to change how they're configured, but you need to capture how they're configured in your policy, because the CMMC is going to test congruency between what you're saying you're doing and what you're doing. So the next step after procuring your equipment, or if you already have equipment, is working with any third party or any IT staff you have in-house to understand what they're doing. And they should be part of that process, your preparation process or your gap analysis process, your remediation process, but they are really part of your, what we're doing here is really building a compliance team, like a cyber compliance team. You have your cyber guys, your cybersecurity people, you have your IT people, and you have your compliance people. And together they will help you get through as you work through domain by domain and control by control, making sure that everything's implemented and documented appropriately.
So I've heard you mention previously about needing more than one person, and you just kind of listed off, some people that need to be involved to make CMMC successful. And I would say, we've seen that as well. One of the things we've noticed is that what starts out often as a CMMC project, a security project nominally, involves much more than just a security overlay on some existing practices. So you talked about, for example, maybe replacing some equipment. It's important that the design of that equipment that you're going to buy maps to CMMC so that you've got that all planned out. So I think, we've seen that it's more than just coming in after a system is built and documenting the security and then going to an audit, right? It's this integrated sort of design, build, document all together, which is kind of a new life cycle for a lot of companies. What are your thoughts on sort of the big picture of compliance? Who's involved? What's impacted? Besides the security team, obviously.
Everybody's impacted. There's a physical security requirement. There's a personnel security requirement. There's training requirements. So like training, for example, yes, your cybersecurity people, if they're performing security functions, there's a training requirement. But there's also a broader training requirement for cybersecurity awareness for your whole company. So if you're, C-suite and your leaders are not bought into this, then they're not going to put resources behind it. Part of the CMMC for the level 3 has a documented resource plan, and your documented resource plan, there's not a standard template, but it has a bunch of pieces that should be in your resource plan, which include humans and money. So literally your whole company has to be behind this effort, or they at least have to be aware of this effort. Your physical security is a thing, right? Like, they have to understand where the controlled environments are, like where is the CUI processed, and understanding that all visitors have to be escorted. So there's far broader implications than just the IT hands-on keyboard cybersecurity aspect of it. And you have to understand all of those tangentially related functions that are all part of the CMMC assessment. Because it's not just that you have to talk about it and do it, but an assessor, a CMMC assessor, according to the assessment guide, is allowed to come in and ask random personnel about any of these controls. So if they pick up a random person in a hallway going to the bathroom and say, ask them about the visitor escort procedure, they should probably be at least familiar with it. So that's like a, change in culture, because you don't want to scramble the last week before your assessment and do these massive training events where you fire hose people with, 300 policy requirements. So it's a culture shift for the whole company.
And I think there's a culture of compliance and there's a culture of security, and you kind of need both, right? So we've heard from the DoD that we shouldn't look at CMMC as a checklist. And how much of the work that you're doing is about compliance, and how much is about security effectiveness, deterring our adversaries? Like, how do you make sure both of those things are getting addressed? When you've got that document that's sitting on your desk, it's easy just to stick your nose in there and read what it says, but we got to think about solar winds and what just happened there and what that means in terms of what are our adversaries actually doing to us.
Yes. One, having a risk assessment is a requirement of the CMMC. So that should be, one of the first things you look at. It's not step 1, it's not step 2, it's maybe step 3A, because you have to mitigate the risks, right? Like, what information do I have that the adversaries want? It's not just your CUI, it could be other aspects like placement and access, right? In the intelligence community, you don't want to make yourself a target. You don't want people to know that you have access or placement to other people who may have things that they want. So OCD Tech is started as an IT auditing company for defense contractors about 8 years ago. And so auditing and compliance is far different than security, right? Security is not, or compliance is not equated to security. So when we engage clients, we look at what they're doing and we try to judge sufficiency, because that's what compliance is what you're doing sufficient to meet the requirement. And back to the education piece, we will tell them, there's the CMMC and NIST 171 doesn't really establish a lot of minimum requirements. Like it says you have to define how many attempts to log in before you're locked out, but it doesn't tell you that it has to be 5 or it has to be 10. It just says you have to define the number. So there are standard settings for Windows, but it's really up to clients to make their own decision on a lot of these things. So educating them on what's sufficient versus what's standard versus what's good, which is why you need multiple people on your team to walk through this, because your cybersecurity person is going to be like, oh, it has to be 2 attempts and then they're locked out forever, and then you have your compliance and policy person who is like, look, minimally sufficient is far different than industry best practices. And the CMMC assessors should be assessing on minimally sufficient, minimally viable product, which is the DoD standard, federal government standard for contracting, but realizing that they're different. So it's a business decision for how businesses, do they want to be minimum or do they want to be good, so it's ultimately up to them. It's not up to your consultant to decide that. I view consultancy as being like a battalion staff officer. I spent too many years as a battalion staff officer informing my battalion commander. Ultimately, it's the battalion commander's decision. I provide multiple courses of action, the most likely, least likely, and most dangerous, and he gets to pick. And at the end of the day, I guide him as best I can. Whether or not I agree with his decision, it's his decision. So that's how I view this kind of consulting.
Cool. So we're at the end of our time, and I was going to ask a wrap-up question, but I have an audience question that I want to work in. So at the risk of running this over a little bit,
Sorry.
Hopefully we have another 2-3 minutes from you and from our audience. This is an audience question that says, I heard you say that assessment is point in time, but I've also heard that it looks at maturity, how we must show policy enforcement and process improvement over time. That seems contradictory. Can you clarify?
Yeah, so showing that you're mature in a point in time, it's a snapshot, right? Like this is not a continuous monitoring event. They're not coming in once a month for 6 months to make sure that you're doing this every day. Showing maturity shows evidence of maturity. So if you have an access control policy, you should keep should have a version control, and you should have like your leadership sign off on it. So if you've had your leader sign off on it and you have shown 2 or 3 updates in your policy, that's showing maturity that you established a policy, that you're doing your periodic reviews of your SSP, and you're seeing things change in your environment, so you're updating it in real time. So you can show evidence of maturity without having it be more than just a point in time assessment. But maturity is, you can show it through documentation, through questions and answers, asking people. They might ask people at your company, how long has this procedure been around? Is this institutionalized? Institutionalizing means saying what you're doing what you're saying, and really having those 2 things be congruent. So being able to demonstrate congruency and institutionalization is a demonstration of maturity.
And as I said earlier, it's new that that's being formally assessed, right? And one of our earlier sessions, we had a C3PAO candidate on, and he talked about that in terms of the difference of other audits that he's been involved in, SOC 1, SOC 2, where you can't demonstrate maturity by having become compliant the day before the auditor got there. Right? It's not sufficient. The maturity is not there. You can't say, I just wrote this policy and now I have it. Here it is.
Yeah. So last night on the town hall, they were very clear, because there is this rumor going around that in the training that some of the trainers are saying that you have to have a policy that's at least X amount of months old. There's no minimum requirement to have a policy that's X amount of weeks or months or years old. That's not maturity. But to your point, yes, if you institute a policy yesterday, chances are it's not institutionalized. So gauging that institutionalization will be key in demonstrating maturity.
Cool. So quick wrap-up question to close out. I always like to ask for kind of one piece of advice, one piece of feedback that you think would improve the CMMC program or improve how we as a community are responding to it. So what's one idea that would improve how we're all going about this?
Go read the interim rule and go read the original source documents. Like I get bombarded with spam emails, messages on LinkedIn every single day. Like, this is a requirement. This has to happen. You're going to lose your job. You're going to lose all this. And it's crazy. It's crazy out there. But if you haven't read the interim rule from cover to cover, go read it. Take notes on it. Try to ingest it and understand exactly what it says. Read NIST 171, read 171 Alpha, read the assessment guide. I know it's boring and it's going to take a long time, but reading the source document, the definitive guidance from the source will help you cut through a whole lot of noise. Yes, it's very boring and it's hard to understand, but if you put that in context with what you're hearing in the market or hearing from DoD officials or hearing from the AB, it'll help you really triangulate the truth, because it's so hard to figure out what's going on. But that's why you need different sources to kind of, put it all together.
Well, Leslie, thank you. I'll say, if you don't have time or enthusiasm to read those documents, hire someone who does.
OCD Tech we're starting this blog series. We're trying to keep it updated to have a new blog every day, but we're trying to break down this type of information in a very short format that like people can read and digest, because it is convoluted and complicated, but we're trying to break down these into digestible bits.
Very good. Well, thanks very much. This was a great information. Very, very interesting conversation, hopefully very valuable to our audience. So thanks to you for joining us. Thanks everyone for attending. I want to mention our next session is going to be Wednesday, February 3rd, our same time slot of 1 p.m. Eastern. My guest will be Stacy Bostjanek, who is the head of the CMMC program office for the DoD. So her first time joining us here, so very interested to get her perspectives on the program from a policymaking and future direction perspective. I also want to mention that tomorrow we have a half-day cybersecurity summit coming up in the afternoon, January 28th tomorrow. This is going to explore the entire path to CMMC, including legal interpretation, techniques for filling the gaps, the assessment process, and we have a keynote at the end, which is around the wake of SolarWinds, right? How is the SolarWinds event that was announced in December going to change the face of cybersecurity in 2021 and beyond? So we have some really great speakers lined up. It's jam-packed half-day session. If you haven't already registered, please check your inbox for an invitation or go to our website, neosystemscorp.com, for those details. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.